Good morning, IPRAISE. This is Minister Natasha Nedrick, and I am here to do the teen talk. So let's talk and get into the message. Racial tensions are high. Unfortunately, it's not a new thing. It seems since the birth of this nation, there has always been one tribe that despised the other. And while some mourn and scream for justice for their brothers and sisters who have been killed in the street, there are others, yes, others who have privilege, who watch from a distance unconcerned that murder is in the land. To make a bad situation even worse, yes, now there is looting and plundering, and there are people who are stealing the wealth and livelihood of other people for no other reason, but they are agitators. The pain is mounting, it's unbearable, the stress level is high as people feel that their lives are being turned around and they are beginning to ask the question, where is God in the midst of this? The people of Judah are asking, where is God in the midst of this? And you may be saying, Minister Natasha, why'd you bring up the people of Judah? Because I wasn't describing our current context directly. I was describing the context out of the book of Obadiah. So if you would grab your nearest Bible, that's where our message is coming out of today. Obadiah. It is where Obadiah is a minor prophet. It is in the Old Testament, and it's literally the shortest book in the Old Testament. So be careful because you can skip over it. But you will see that there are so many similarities between what is going on now in our culture and what is going on in Obadiah. You will see that there are racial tensions that are high in the text. You have the people of Edom, who are descendants of Esau, and you have the people of Judah, who are descendants of Jacob, who have long-standing tension with each other. They despise one another. You will see that there is political unrest. In fact, in their case, there's even war that is happening, and people are being oppressed and taken advantage of, and their things and possessions are being stolen. You will also see that there is murder that is happening, and you have some people who are watching from a distance. And you might be saying, Minister Natasha, why are you bringing all these things up? What does that have to do with things going on today? You also see how God responds and how God says that he is going to flip the script. And so let's go into the text and see what God did then, and also what God will do for us now. Now, I like the Message Bible because it just sometimes makes hard text plain. And so if we turn to the Message Bible, starting at verse 10, or whatever translation, you can follow along with me as I read. It says, because of the murderous history compiled against your brother Jacob, you will be looked down upon by everyone. This is what God is saying as he condemns Edom. So on that day you stood there and you didn't do anything. Strangers took your brother's army into exile. Godless foreigners invaded and pillaged Jerusalem, and you stood there and watched. Does that sound like something that we've seen in society? People who stand there and watch as violence happens. It says you were as bad as they were. You shouldn't have gloated over your brother when he was down and out. You shouldn't have laughed and joked at Judah's sons when they were face down in the mud. You shouldn't have talked so big when everything was so bad. You shouldn't have taken advantage of my people when their lives had fallen apart. You of all people shouldn't have been amused by their troubles, their wrecked nation. You shouldn't have taken advantage. You shouldn't have taken the shirts off their back when they were knocked down flat and defenseless. You shouldn't have stood and watched at the outskirts and cut off refugees. Again, does this not sound like the times that we are in today? And traitorously turned in helpless survivors who had lost everything? People seeking asylum? What does God say about that? God says God's judgment day is near you. For all the godless nations, as you have done, it will be done to you. What you did will boomerang back and hit your head. Just as God parted on my holy mountain, all the godless nations will drink God's wrath, and they'll drink themselves to death. But not so on Mount Zion. There, respite there, a safe and a holy place. The family of Jacob will take back their possessions from those who took from them. And so for the rest of the time that is ours, I just want to talk about the idea that God will flip the script and avenge people who are oppressors. In this text that we just read, we can clearly see that God is taking the side of people who have been oppressed, people who are his people. And you may be saying, you see that God has called them violent. And you may be wondering, what violent act did the people of Edom do to so upset God that has God condemning them? And this is, I think, a really important thing, even as youth, for you to realize that God said the violent act that they did is that they stood and watched. They stood and watched. And he says, and scripture says, and that made them as bad as the people who were violent. Now that reminded me of course, the story of George Floyd. Whew, I mean, get emotional even just thinking about it. Who was murdered, essentially lynched in the street by one officer who had a knee on him, but 3 others who just watched. God said watching was an evil act. So the first point that we must see is that, 1, God defines violence. God defines violence. It's interesting because some people, through the case of even Rayshard Brooks, will say, well, it's not a violent act, or it's not a wrong act, it's not an immoral act because somebody behaved a certain way. But what scripture tells us is that God defines, it's his creation, and God defines what violence really is. And God doesn't say that violence is just the act itself, it's also the things you don't do. It's the inactions that he says are just as violent. It's the way that you stood there. And God will vindicate and step in when people won't. But I think that's also a word for us for the things we do have control over. Because the truth of the matter is, I think we can all name times when we have seen violence and not done anything. When we have seen violence, we've seen maybe a fight that was about to break out, and you saw your friend and you knew you had the ability to step in and say, hey, let's not do it, don't do it. But you decided not to get engaged. You decided you didn't want to be involved. You decided that you didn't want to be a part of it. But sometimes God calls you to prevent the violence by stepping in. And I'm not telling you not to be unwise. If you walk into and there's already a fight going on, I'm not telling you to break it up. But I am saying that in the scripture, God is very clear that watching violence, recording violence on your phone is just as bad at that point. You are perpetuating the violence, right? And so, 1, this scripture shows us that God defines what violence is, and that God takes it serious. It's not just the actions, it's the inactions. It's the fact that that some people have the ability, and there are certain things that you have the ability to act. There are certain words that you can say. There are certain times that you can walk away when people are being rude or bullying people. And God said, even if you're not the one bullying someone, you standing and watching is a violent act, and that God will step in. That's what the word says. So that's point 1. The second thing we'll see in this text is that God also defines and does the work of justice. And you may say, what is justice? It just simply means that God will restore the things that God will intervene and set right the things. Maybe that's a great way to say. God will set right the things that are broken. And that God defines what that justice looks like. And so in this case, God saw that the people of Judah had been beaten. They had seen the people had been experiencing oppression and strife and a lot of things that as African Americans we experience all the time. And God said that judgment day was coming. So that one means that God is watching, God is aware, God knows everything that's happening. If you say, where is God? As the question was in the beginning, where is God? God is sitting and watching, but he's also going to intervene. God is not going to be sitting so high that he's not going to be involved in our problems or what is going on in our lives. And God is a God of justice and setting things right, and setting and turning things, flipping things on their head, unexpected ends. And so God is a God of justice. There are those who you may come in contact with you who will argue with you and say that social justice should not be a part of the narrative of the church. But you can see clearly in this passage that God is a God of justice. The last thing I want to talk about in this text is that God will restore. God will restore. And in this passage, it talks about how not only will things boomerang back, so the bad things that have happened will happen to somebody, but also that God will restore all the things that have been taken from Judah. That God will restore, that God will fix. And there are some things that maybe you feel like you've experienced some unjust things in the world, that maybe you've had a job loss in your family and it's harder. You're just having a harder life right now, but God will restore it. Maybe you've had some family members that died from COVID and you're sad and depressed and hurt, but God will still even restore your spirit. God will restore everything that is broken, and he is aware and is watching and cares for everything that is going on in your life. And so I encourage you this week to take some time to examine this passage. It is all of one chapter, so you can completely do it. Just meditate on Obadiah this week and see how God responds and how God will flip the script and intervene and restore things that have been broken. I love you guys. I can't wait to see you and hug you sometime, well, sooner than later. Let's just say it like that. See you guys. Bye.